when October 7 came about, and not for a second did I think that what I had to say would be considered controversial. It was so obvious to me. There was a terrorist attack against innocent people that was utterly abhorrent. And so I said exactly that. I condemned absolutely the actions of Hamas and those who funded them and supported them, and stood staunchly alongside the people who had been massacred, the children who had been burned alive, the women whose bodies had been raped.
Welcome to this episode of Shoulder to Shoulder, a podcast where a pastor and a rabbi get to the heart of issues that matter to people of faith. I'm Pastor Doug Reed, here with my friend Rabbi Pesach Wolicki. On this episode, we'll be having a conversation with media superstar Erin Molan. Before we jump into our conversation, please like our Facebook page and join our Facebook group, the Shoulder to Shoulder Community, where you can interact with Pesach and me all week long. You also have to stop on over to YouTube. Yes, we are on YouTube right now. We've got a couple episodes up and you want to check it out on YouTube. The best way, though, to support this podcast is to go on over to Patreon, subscribe to our Shoulder to Shoulder page. For just $10 a month, you're helping us bring this message of shoulder to shoulder to more and more people all around the world. As a thank you for your $10 subscription, you'll get exclusive access to chapter-by-chapter Bible study beginning in Genesis chapter 1 from Rabbi Pesach and myself. So go on over to Patreon, subscribe to Shoulder for just $10 a month. We're grateful to our sponsor, Israel 365 News, which is the place for you to go and get your news and information before going to anyone else. Go on over to Israel365news.com to check out some of their articles, and be sure to read Rabbi Pesach and my column. Pesach, each and every week we have incredible offers and products that we support at Israel 365. What are we supporting today?
Well, we're going to do the same thing we did last week. That's what they told me. So we are talking about subscribing to Israel 365 newsletter and the Israel 365 Action newsletter. Israel 365 News, as you just talked about, Doug, is a news website that gives you analysis and news written by Jews and Christians from a biblical perspective, Israel365news.com. But click the link in the description of this podcast. And if you're watching on YouTube, you'll see it in the description of the YouTube video to sign up. It'll take you to a sign up page where you can sign up for one or both of the Israel 365 News daily newsletter. You will get in your inbox headlines and links to analytical pieces as well from Israel, because you cannot rely on truth about Israel coming to you organically through the algorithm. It doesn't really work that way. You have to seek it out. So sign up for the Israel 365 News Daily Newsletter, and sign up for the Israel 365 Action Weekly Newsletter. Israel 365 Action is the advocacy movement that I lead, standing unapologetically for Israel's God-given right to the entirety of the land of Israel, including, of course, Judea, Samaria, and Jerusalem. We mobilize Jews and Christians to work together to counter lies, to confront Israel's enemies, and defend Judeo-Christian civilization at the highest levels of government, media, and grassroots activism. We have webinars. We have a lot going on. And that's a weekly newsletter, keep you up to date and informed. It'll also keep you up to date on all the video content we're putting out. So subscribe to Israel 365 Action. You can also check it out at the Israel365action.com website. And let me just also add, Doug, that this new YouTube initiative, Shoulder to Shoulder podcast, is now on YouTube. You get to actually see Pastor Doug and myself yapping away. And you'll find it currently it is housed at my personal YouTube channel. That's YouTube. Just look up Rabbi Pesach Wolicki or Pesach Wolicki on YouTube, and you'll find the channel pretty easily. And they're all getting posted there. And there's also a playlist on that page just for the Shoulder to Shoulder episodes. And we're going to start uploading them every single week. And that also means we now have a new video editor who's working on all that stuff. And thank you to all the subscribers who are helping us pay the video editor and other expenses that we have with this podcast. You're really making this possible. And those of you who haven't subscribed yet, we'd be grateful to have you join us and really keep the Shoulder to Shoulder community growing.
All right. Excellent. And make sure you stop on by at Israel 365, subscribe right on their website. Well, Pesach, speaking about the truth around Israel, I saw some headlines. There was a bunch of Christian media that were taking issue with the fact that Israel has an incredibly large gay pride event happening at the Dead Sea. I saw there was this massive event and people were making all kinds of comments. I saw several prominent Christian leaders speaking out and making statements about it. And to some extent, I have to say this to our listeners, this isn't a surprise. Tel Aviv, Israel, has one of the largest gay pride parades and events, and it's the only country in the Middle East that has anything like that. It's one of the things that Israel advocates often celebrate is the fact that minority groups are allowed to express themselves in Israel. But, well, a lot of our Christian supporters are not supporting Israel necessarily for this reason. And so it's caused some friction, to say the least, between the Christian community that supports Israel and those other advocates that are putting out, this is amazing, this is great, because this minority group gets to celebrate openly and freely, and they don't have the ability to do that in Syria or Lebanon or Jordan or anywhere else. But it does happen in Israel, and they wear it as a badge of honor. What do we do with this, Pesach?
Well, first of all, the fact that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs put out this announcement on X, Pride rises at the lowest place on earth. This June, the Dead Sea becomes Pride Land, the biggest LGBTQ plus festival ever in the Middle East. And you say that there's a very, it's incredibly large. I don't know how large it is. It's definitely the biggest in the Middle East, but that doesn't say much. In most countries in the Middle East, as you indicated, people from this community are persecuted or killed.
They're thrown off buildings. They're not welcome.
But even in places where it's not that severe, they are definitely persecuted. It's illegal in most of the countries in the Middle East to even be gay. So, yeah, there's that. But at first I saw some anti-Israel people, some haters jumping on this and my usual defensiveness about double standards, like, come on. The fact is that Israel is a country that is very diverse. But the problem with the narrative is that those who are anti-Israel who've been jumping on this have been painting it as, like, look how depraved these Israelis are. Right? As though it's indicative of something wrong with Israeli society. And then I saw even from some very good friends of ours, so people like Troy Miller, the head of the NRB, who's a very close friend of mine, the president and CEO of the NRB. He is a diehard Christian Zionist to the core. He loves Israel. He supports Israel. And he put out a tweet where he wrote, celebrating the community that marches around the world with the enemies of Israel is mind-boggling, let alone that violates core commandments in the scriptures. Stop promoting this. So he was raising two issues. He was raising the fact that it's obviously anti-biblical values. He was also raising the fact that the LGBT community worldwide is pretty much lockstep anti-Israel and part of the progressive left. So, like, what are you doing? And these are two separate issues that Troy was raising here. But I want to kind of calm everyone down with, first of all, Ami Kozak. You might be familiar with him, the comedian. He does a lot of impressions of, like, Tucker Carlson and others. He's actually a very smart guy. He's a very thoughtful person. He put up a very nice tweet, which I'm going to read. He wrote, Israel is many things, a Jewish state, the ancestral biblical homeland of the Jewish people. It's also a secular, democratic, modern nation state. Balancing these dimensions is part of the country's complex, constant, ongoing reality. One thing is for sure. Perception-wise, it seems that Israel can't win. When it features its strength, virtue, patriotism, religious identity, and national pride, the left turns on it. When it features its progressive values, tolerance, secularism, and openness, the right turns on it. This all loses sight of the bigger picture. Would you rather live in a free country that has some elements you don't agree with, or an unfree country that has some elements you do agree with? As far as I'm concerned, I'm much more offended by the gay people thrown off the rooftops in Gaza than the ones gathering in Tel Aviv, and you should be too. I thought that was an appropriate response, but I want to give a response. If I was talking to Troy Miller right now, and maybe I'll send him this podcast afterwards, or maybe he listens, I don't know. Maybe I'll give him a call and talk about it. Let's talk about Israeli society. Because yes, we have a gay community. We have a gay community in Tel Aviv. It's true. But Israeli society is far more conservative politically, in terms of both politically and in terms of its values, its family values, than America, than pretty much anywhere in the Western world. And I'll cite just some polling information. Svika Klein, the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, put up a tweet thread a few weeks ago about a recent poll that was done by Ma'ariv, one of the major newspapers in Israel. And he put up a tweet thread about it. And it's all about how younger Israelis are moving to the right. And we've talked about this, Doug. We've talked about it on the podcast, that the left in Israel has been shrinking for years. But he goes even further. But this poll goes even further, and he highlights a few points here. So here's what it says here. This was a poll done of Israelis aged 18 to 22. Their top choice for prime minister is Benjamin Netanyahu by far. And that's this isn't a plug for Benjamin Netanyahu, but he's a right-wing guy, and it's more from the conservative side of the aisle. 57% of those polled, this is the key, 57% of those polled said that their religious faith grew stronger since October 7th. 54% said they feel more connected to Jewish tradition. Okay, and they're moving to the right. And they're very nationalistic. They're very patriotic. Israelis tend to have, they get married and have families at a young age, and they have big families. So the trajectory of Israeli society is towards more conservative values, more family values, more biblical values. And yes, we have a gay community. We don't persecute them. We don't make it illegal. We allow them to flourish and be who they are. But let's make no mistake about it. That segment of society, if we're thinking about the trajectory of the values of the Israeli people, that segment of society is becoming less and less of a factor in Israeli culture. It may always be there. And again, we're not going to persecute these people. I do question the wisdom of the foreign ministry, publicizing this the way they did. They have to be sensitive to who their friends and who their enemies are, and that's what Troy Miller was talking about here. And maybe there's a different way to do it. There's also a kind of dark irony that I'm not even sure they're aware of, that where this is happening is down at the it's literally at the hotel resorts in the southern part of the Dead Sea area, which is where Sodom is. And right. I can't believe that that's the location they chose for it, unless it was on purpose because they're so disdainful of the Bible. But yeah, listen, I'm no fan of this stuff either. But I just wanted to put a little perspective on this. Again, here's my point. If you're going to use this to say Israel is a depraved, progressive left place, it's just not true. Israel is a far more conservative, far more right-wing, far more biblically valued place. Society than anywhere you're going to find in the Western world. We also happen to be a free society that doesn't persecute people, and we allow them to be who they are. So that's my take on this. I wanted to put that out there.
Well, and I think, though, from a Christian perspective, I get hung up, and where I think a lot of fellow pastors and others get hung up is when the progressive left LGBTQ try and take their set lifestyle and then tell me that it's actually biblical values. What they're actually doing is from the Bible. And I don't think we have that the Israeli government's not making a case that this is conservative biblical values, but they are doing their best, as that tweet said, to kind of, blend the fact that they are in a secular state. And yes, they also have they're in a Jewish state. And how do you navigate that? Well, you're not, to your point, you're not going to, absolutely write off a whole segment of your population. But in the same breath, you're also not telling everybody, oh, well, this is a good religious thing. This is good from a religious value standpoint. This is actually important for Bible-believing Jews or Christians. No, this is part of our culture. This is part of our society. These people are here. It's a reality. And we're going to live, we're going to coexist in this society, and they're going to have equal rights, and they're going to be able to live their life and express themselves. And I think those are two different arguments for the state to say, hey, we have these populations. But this, on the other hand, I think where a lot of the pastors and the Christians and the tweets and stuff that I've seen have come from, they're coming at this saying, well, it's not biblical values. And I don't think the state of Israel is claiming that it's biblical values. They're saying this is the reality of the secular state that we live in. And I think that's a perfectly fine place to be. And I feel like the United States does the same thing. I think you have to navigate the country in which you live in, and you can't I don't want anybody to marginalize Christians in America in the same way I don't think anyone should be marginalized, but calling something biblical values versus, hey, this is the country we live in, we're all here, and they need to have a space to do this. I don't have as much an issue with that kind of thought process versus telling me it's biblical values and trying to convince me that somehow I'm not following the Bible because I'm not standing lockstep with those folks and their values and beliefs.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think there's also something else about Christians and how they view Israel. And a lot of Christians who support Israel kind of romanticize Israel as, because their support from Israel is coming from a place of biblical faith, they also romanticize Israel and its leaders. And so the fact that Prime Minister Netanyahu, for example, is not an observant Jew, I mean, he observes some things, but he's not really, he's not a fully observant Jew. And he comes from, he's reportedly become more traditional in more recent years. He's definitely biblically literate. But the fact that Israel was founded by secularists, and is still a secular state in the majority of its government and in the approach of its government, is something that I think a lot of Christians don't really think about much. And again, they romanticize the state of Israel. So if the state of Israel does something that's anti-biblical, it's not the same as America doing something that's like that. It's upsetting them. It's like, wait a second, I'm supporting them and they're doing this. And the only reason I'm supporting them, well, they wouldn't say only reason, but the main driver of my support is biblical values, is my biblical faith. And this is an abomination in biblical faith. So I think that's where the disconnect and the anger is coming from. And like I said, I wouldn't have talked about this if it was only the haters, the Israel haters who were jumping all over this, but it wasn't. I saw it coming from friends of ours who were genuinely uncomfortable with this. And I understand where it's coming from, but that's why I said, I think the best approach is like what you said, to say, look, what kind of society are we supposed to have here? Do you want us to have a society where we, repress and oppress these people?
But I actually think there's a biblical case to be made for the state of Israel in its current position prophetically. If you want to make this case from Ezekiel, God promises to gather them in. He's bringing the Jews back, and then he's going to wash them, and he's going to pure. And there's a whole process to this. So expecting them to come back to and not be a secular state and to be perfect and that it's all sunshine and rainbows is just not the bibiblical narrative. Ezekiel prophesies they're going to come back.
Did you say sunshine and rainbows? Is that what you said?
Did you like that? I thought it was appropriate for what we're talking about. But bottom line, I think, biblically, I think there's a case to be made that yes, they are a secular state, and yes, they are moving forward in some things that you may not be comfortable with, but they're in prophetic process. This isn't over with. It's not fully ingathered. God's not done with the process, and he promises there in Ezekiel that he's going to wash them. He's going to put his spirit inside of them. He's going to do that, and that's all part of the process. We don't have to get hung up that it's not fully complete.
Yeah, I like that a lot. It's also Deuteronomy 30, the very first time, Deuteronomy 30 that I quote all the time about how even if you are scattered to the ends of the heavens, from there the Lord your God will gather you and bring you back to the land of your forefathers, and he will, and you will inherit it and you will possess it, and you'll become more numerous and more prosperous than your ancestors. And then only after that. So after the ingathering, after becoming more numerous and more prosperous. So the ingathering has happened. We've already taken possession of it. So that means there's a Jewish state, and it's a prosperous Jewish state. And we're ingathered from the four corners of the earth. And all of that has happened. And then in the next verse says, and the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your offspring to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, that you may live. In other words, there's a spiritual process that the nation of Israel goes through after the physical ingathering and state of Israel is put together, and that is the biblical view of it. That's the way it's supposed to happen, and that's why I shared with you that polling information that was shared by Tzvika Klein, the editor of the Jerusalem Post, about how that's happening. The nation of Israel, if you go younger, the younger generation of the nation of Israel has stronger biblical values, has more conservative values than their parents' and grandparents' generations. And that's exactly what we would hope to see. And biblically speaking, prophetically speaking, what we would expect to see. So, yeah. It was definitely some kind of a misstep. It definitely didn't go well for us that this was out there, but it's an opportunity to have an important conversation.
Absolutely. Well, we have an important conversation that we need to get to. We have the media superstar, news anchor, podcaster, Erin Molan joining us from Australia. So, Pesach, why don't you go ahead and make that introduction?
Erin Molan, welcome to the Shoulder to Shoulder podcast.
Rabbi Wolicki, it is such an honor to finally having you ask me the questions, how it should always have been.
Absolutely.
How are you? Lovely to see you, Doug. Lovely to see you as well.
Yes, thank you for being here.
Yeah, we're doing great. So, Erin, and I want to thank you for having me on your show. We've had some good times going after Candace and Joe Kent and all of them. And everyone on this podcast has heard those stories and seen those clips. But, how did you, this Catholic girl from Australia, end up in this Israel space? Shortly after October 7th, as a Jew in Israel, as people in the pro-Israel space, suddenly this blonde girl from Australia burst onto the scene, speaking common sense, speaking morality, speaking about good and evil in clear tones. And it kind of took everyone by surprise. We're not used to people speaking that clearly. And that's really why you captured all of our attention. There are so many people in Israel who follow you. But I wanted to get into the background of this. Tell us about Erin Molan. Where did you come from? Who are you? And then tell us the story about what happened after October 7th and how you ended up so passionate about the Israel cause.
Well, Rabbi, I'm the daughter of an army soldier. He was a major general when he retired and then an Australian senator. And like most people, I think I'm very much the product of my parents. And Dad was amazing and lived the most incredible life of service, first in the military and spent many postings overseas, including in East Timor, in Iraq, in the Middle East. And Mum, they met when she was 17, he was 18, good Catholic girl from Melbourne, Australia, and they were each other's first everything and were together until, unfortunately, we lost Dad a couple of years ago to cancer. And Dad's journey was very public in Australia. He had a very high profile. He always used to tell me the saddest day of his life was when he stopped being Jim Molan, the Major General Australian Senator, and started to become Erin Molan's dad. They would say, "Oh, you're Erin Molan's dad." He said, "Of all I've achieved in the world," but I think he secretly loved it. But Mum, of course, who didn't have the profile of Dad and who dedicated herself for the major part of her life to raising us kids, and we went to 16 different schools, moved around all the time, including overseas postings, having to watch her husband go off to war, keep the family unit together at home. It was a love unlike anything I've ever experienced from Mum. And I think the combination of Dad's strength, his morality, his courage, his character, combined with Mum's equal traits, but in different ways, enabled me to live a life that I'm immensely proud of thus far. And my siblings, I think, would say exactly the same and in their own ways. Have turned into the most incredible people. October 7 came about and I guess maybe naivety to some extent. I was a sports host prior to starting on Sky News in the political commentary sphere. I always loved politics, loved national security, loved defence, loved foreign affairs. But the first part of my career was almost 20 years as the first woman in Australia to host different sporting events on national TV. And that came with its own challenges. But it meant I wasn't that dipped into the other space to the extent that I am now. When October 7 came about, I hosted a show that was called Erin. It was my take on events globally. And not for a second did I think that what I had to say would be considered controversial. It was so obvious to me. There was a terrorist attack against innocent people that was utterly abhorrent, that was horrific, that made me feel sick to my stomach. And not for a second was I ever going to go live on air and talk about context, talk about, oh, but look at the history, talk about, oh, but that, none of that came into it for a second. It was so obvious to me that this was good versus evil. And so I said exactly that. I condemned absolutely the actions of Hamas and those who funded them and supported them, and stood staunchly alongside the people who had been massacred, the children who had been burned alive, the women whose bodies had been raped. And the backlash was almost unlike anything I had ever experienced before. And like my father's daughter, my show was weekly. The next week I got back on, having had a week of something similar to hell. And it's all relative, isn't it? My experience was nothing like those who had gone through October 7. But I was told, just don't touch it. Pull back, cover other things. I had to give my daughter to her father for a period because the death threats were considered legitimate. I had police protection taking me into underground car parks. It was awful. But of course, I got back on there the next week and I went harder. And I looked down that screen and I said, try me. And I haven't slowed down ever since. And again, I absorb sources of information from every corner. I watch networks I disagree with. I read things from people who I don't see eye to eye with. I make sure I have context. I make sure that I visited sites of October 7. I spoke to people. I speak to people from all different sides. And not once have I wavered in my stance that this is good versus evil.
Absolutely. And I remember seeing those viral clips early on and sharing them out on Instagram and thinking like, this is incredible. Like common sense. Thank God somebody is saying the right thing. Did you find a difference for yourself, though, from seeing it on a screen and through X and through social media versus actually going to the sites? I was there on October 7th with some pilgrims, and we were one of the last flights out of Israel. And then I went back on the anniversary, and I brought my kids and my wife, and we were there for a solidarity event down at the Nova Festival site. And I think going to the actual location for me was much different than seeing it on a screen. I empathized on a screen. I had been to Israel multiple times. I believed and I connected and I cried and I was in the space through the screen, but actually going back and being there on the ground and hearing the testimonies and the stories live in person, it's just such a different dynamic. What was that experience like for you?
I think you're spot on. And I made the point, I had never been to Israel prior, and my first trip was after October 7. And wow. I didn't go because I needed to see with my own eyes to believe what had occurred. I already believed, and that was very obvious throughout my commentary. But I felt like I could do a better job of trying to highlight this evil and trying to show the world exactly what occurred if I'd seen it with my own eyes. And I went to every site that was impacted. I spoke to people. I watched every second of that raw vision, every single second. And other people I was with, particularly the women, had to leave after a few minutes, which I completely understood. But I forced myself to stay because I knew that the more I could see, the more I felt, the better I would be at. And it sounds insane, convincing people of what had occurred, and the fact that people needed to be convinced when the terrorists themselves had filmed much of these atrocities. It still does not compute to me on any level. I went and I stood in rooms, gentlemen, where two little girls the same age as my daughter were burned alive, having watched their parents be killed, along with their little brother. I stood in that room and I can't put into words how that felt or what that was like. Reading things written on the wall that people who knew they were going to die had wrote. The Nova Music Festival. Now, I didn't go to many festivals growing up. It was never really my thing, but I can't think of one friend of mine that didn't go to at least one as a teen. And to look at these pictures of the most beautiful young people with their entire lives ahead of them, to stand in containers, rubbish containers where they huddled and hid, and to be told exactly how each one of them perished. Again, horrific. But my dad used to say, we can't fight an evil we don't understand. We can't fight an enemy we don't understand. And you can't defeat it if you refuse to understand it, if you refuse to name it, if you refuse to see what it does. And it was a life-changing experience. But I'll counter it with this. Walking out of that room where those two little girls and their little brother were burned alive. And again, it's not even that they were killed. What will never leave my mind, and it's the same with all of them. And I'll get emotional because it's impossible. I don't want to lose this emotion because that will mean that this doesn't impact me, and I've lost my humanity. But to think of the fear that they would have felt, the pain of just I can't comprehend it still. But to walk outside from that and to see a woman watering flowers at a place a couple of doors down, and to walk over to her, I gave her a hug and I said, "Is this your place?" And she said, "No." I said, "Is it a relative's, a friend?" She said, "No, I drive an hour once a week to water the flowers. It's a hostage's home. And when she comes home, I want these flowers to be alive." Wow. And I kind of, to juxtapose the enemy with the people of Israel. And I thought to myself, that is Israel. I see people gather post-October 7, the victims gather and all they want are their people home. All they chant is bring them home. That is Israel. That is Judaism. The other side, what do they chant? The side who carried out the slaughter. They chant for more slaughter, from the river to the sea, intifada, death to Jews. That's the enemy. It's not hard to determine which is which, and seeing it firsthand and seeing the way that the Jewish people and the Israeli people still seek out love and still live with hope and no hate. I don't see hate, and I'm sure it exists. It would have to, because of the hell that has been unleashed upon them. But overwhelming that and overriding that is love and hope and this eternal desire for peace, which, given what they've gone through, is so hard for me to fathom.
Erin, this is it warms my heart to hear you talk about this, and you probably gotten a glimpse of how under siege by the media us Jews in Israel feel. So I asked the question from that place, that when you first went on the air and said what you said, and you mentioned before that you got backlash. I want to hear more. Like, I don't know what you're allowed to tell us, if there's things that you're not allowed to say, but what happened there, like at the network with the people who were, what were those conversations like? And you eventually, of course, left Sky News, and now you're doing other things. But what was that? What were those conversations like? You must have been stunned by the pushback, considering the conviction that you're speaking with.
Absolutely. And I'll say this, Sky News was not the culprit here. And I've said that many, many times, in that they were probably the leading network in Australia in terms of having common sense. The pushback and the price that I paid essentially came from other quarters. And I had multiple jobs and endorsements and different things. And, a lot of it came from the pro-Palestinian community. A lot of it came from people who were just terrified of anything controversial. And so I know I obviously did lose my job fairly shortly afterwards, but that, you look at the other people who were on Sky News, and a lot of them were very staunch and strong in their support of Israel. But the blowback in other places was, and I've had kind of, trolling. In fact, I was, they called it Erin's Law, the Online Safety Act that was introduced into Australia, that was passed through Parliament because of what I'd gone through online as the first woman in different spaces. I'd fought so hard to protect our kids online, and an act to do exactly that had gone through Parliament. So I was battle hardened in that space of online hate. The difference here was that the people who were threatening to do things, unlike when I was a sports anchor, they were, 40-year-olds in their mother's basement who had no life and were just trying to be chaotic and to hurt me with words and verbally. The people in this space who despised me now because of my take were those willing to actually carry out acts. And I think that was the difference to for the first time really to legitimately fear for my safety and then to have people and relationships, whether they be professional or personal, suddenly completely be removed from my life because I had dared to speak against a terrorist group and had stood with the innocent victims of it was mind-blowing to me, to be honest, absolutely mind-blowing. And then I watched the industry that I used to be very proudly a part of cover this in a way that I knew was completely disingenuous, completely full of falsehoods and propaganda, was unsettling and was deeply disturbing. And then as an extension of that, I watched a country that I loved and felt immensely proud of, a country that my father was willing to give his life for time and time again, not only in some ways support what had occurred, but even those who didn't, their silence was deafening. And you look at the Opera House straight after October 7 and you look at the protests that occurred there, and not even protests, it was essentially a celebration of October 7 and people chanting, F the Jews. You know, they contest, we didn't say gas the Jews, we said F the Jews, like that's so much better. But whatever they said, cheering and celebrating and smiling and dancing and singing over October 7 as people were still being slaughtered. I watched that play out in the midst of going through my own kind of backlash to all of this. And I just remember thinking, this doesn't terrify me because there will be evil in every society. You will never rid yourself of pockets of evil. There will be people who wish you harm and who will be as disgusting as every soul who went to that event is. What terrified me was the response and the lack thereof. And not just of our leadership, which I thought was so weak and disgraceful in so many ways, which then led to what we saw in Bondi directly, no doubt about it. But my fellow Australians, the silence of this silent majority terrified me. That's when I really thought we have a serious problem in this country, because the Australia I know, doesn't matter where you come from, who you are, whether you're a first generation, second generation migrant, it doesn't matter whether you've been here for 100 years, would never have tolerated that kind of hate and disgusting behaviour, but they did.
So, Erin, you mentioned that you come to this from common sense. You said it was obvious, there was good, there was evil. You came to this as a journalist, as an observer of the world. How has your trip to Israel, how has your perspective on this, how did October 7th shape your faith personally? How did this touch you? And what has changed in your life personally through this?
It's a great question. I think, look, as I said, I was raised Catholic, baptized Catholic, but there was a period there where I didn't feel connected to God at all for a long time. And I think a lot of that started, and this is the insanity of, so many people, oh, you're a right-wing nut job. And, I've got a gay brother. I'm socially very progressive. I love everyone and anything as long as you don't want to kill people and you're not a terrorist. And I'm pretty open and accepting. And for me, I kind of looked at the Catholic Church and the way that they made him feel like he wasn't a part of it and couldn't be a part of that. I pulled back a fair bit, and it's probably been maybe over the past couple of years that I've felt much closer to God, and I've wanted to reconnect that relationship with religion and with God. And I think, I look at the faith that the people of Israel and that Jews have all over the world, and I watched a community, particularly here in Australia, and I live in a very Jewish area, and I watched people that appeared to me to be as broken as the mother of a hostage who had been killed. And that to me was I understood empathy and I understood hurt and pain on behalf of someone else. I feel like I read a headline about a child that has been harmed and I feel like I feel that so deeply. But I watched a community, to be honest, when everything was said and done, all they had at times was their faith. That was it. And to me, that was very, very powerful to witness. It was hard to witness because I saw trauma and I saw suffering, but I never saw any wavering in faith. And that didn't mean that some people were saying, you know, I traveled the world and spoke to hostages, parents and families. And one of the mothers said, you know, I'm still not talking to him that much, but I know he's there, but I'm, you know, we're not on good terms right now. And I got that, but her faith in him being there was unwavering. And I think off the back of Rabbi Charlie Kirk, off the back of different things that have happened, I felt this real desire to reconnect and to want to have that in my life, and to want my daughter to have that almost more than anything else too. And I felt like I've been an irresponsible parent in that I haven't really taken her on a faith journey or instilled in her what it is. And it's just been the last maybe 6 months, a year, that we talk much more about God now. And so I'm excited about this next chapter. And I was in the UK last week in London with a bishop who I'd had on my show. And we prayed together, and he held my hand and he said, you know, Lord, I give my life to you. And we said that over and over a few times, and it was so emotional and so powerful. And yeah, I'm excited. I'm certainly no expert, and I don't kind of even know the right way to go about it, but I have the intent and I have the desire, and I feel like that's probably enough.
Well, Erin, now you're hanging out with rabbis and pastors and bishops. It's, you know, it's
single.
It's a whole different life for yourself. So, Erin, I know you only have a few minutes left. I just wanted to make sure that you tell our audience how to follow you, how to find your shows. A lot of our audience is in the U.S., and I know that you're on the Salem Network there. Maybe you could just tell everyone all the different places that they can catch your content, because it's so important. What you're doing is so vital. And again, I just want to echo what our producer said off camera before the interview. The entire Jewish people, the entire Israeli people, everyone knows who you are. There's a gratitude for someone, because with the world telling lies about us and you know, doing what they were doing, and you were this light in the darkness, and you really inspired a lot of people in this country. So I know I speak for so much of our audience when I say thank you for that. But go ahead and tell our audience where they can follow everything you're doing.
That means so much. And I'll finish it with this point. I remember learning about the Holocaust in year 3 or year 4. And I think what stayed with me, apart from the horrors of it, which are so obvious, was learning about the people who stood by and did nothing. And that was a big part of learning about it. And I remember thinking, even as a 9, 10-year-old, not that I thought I would ever be tested, because the world could never do anything like that again. Of course, you know, that was the mentality I had. But I always had hope that if I were ever tested, that I would not be one of those bystanders. And I always remember going home and talking to mum and dad about it, and being incapable of understanding how people could stand by and let that occur to innocent people. And so, you know, what comforts me is in 100 years, when they look back at this horrific period in time, I will not be someone who stood by and did nothing. And that's something really special to me. Where you can watch me, the YouTube channel, Erin Molan, The Erin Molan Show, on the Salem Network. We're on the weekend, the Salem News Channel, Saturday and Sunday, all the social media, anywhere and everywhere. It would be amazing to have your support. We put out things all the time. I have no life apart from my child and this, so I care deeply. So we're doing things all the time. But it's an honor and it's a privilege, genuinely, to stand up for a community that I respect so much.
No, that's wonderful. Well, Erin, I'll be praying for your faith journey. So thankful to have you. Thank you for sharing, and so appreciate you being on Shoulder to Shoulder. Thank you.
You guys do an amazing job. Thank you. Lots of love.
And thank you for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, rate, and share this podcast. Subscribe on Patreon. Come on over to Facebook. Like our page. Join our group, as we would love to connect with more and more of our Shoulder to Shoulder family. And we will see you on our next episode.